police arrived before my furniture did. I had barely stepped out of the moving truck when 2 patrol cars rolled slowly down the quiet lake road and stopped right in front of the house. Lights flashing, doors opening, officers stepping out like something serious had just happened. One of them walked toward me and asked a question I definitely wasn't expecting to hear that morning. "Sir, do you live here?" I looked at the huge moving truck behind me, the boxes stacked on the driveway, and the keys in my hand. "Yeah," I said. "I literally just bought the place." The officer nodded slowly and glanced toward the house next door. That's when I noticed a woman standing on her porch with her arms crossed, staring at me like I had just committed a crime. That was my first introduction to the neighborhood HOA Karen, and the reason the police were standing in my driveway at 8 in the morning. But the crazy part is, she had no idea who she had just called the police on. Because not only did I own that lake house, I owned the entire block. Before we get into what happened next, if you enjoy crazy HOA stories and entitled neighbor drama, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. This is Karen Stories Daily, where we share stories just like this one. Trust me, this situation gets a lot more awkward for Karen as the day goes on. Now back to that morning. The officer asked for my ID just to confirm everything. I handed it to him and also showed him the property documents I had saved on my phone from the closing paperwork. He looked through them and nodded. "Looks good to me," he said. Then he looked over at the woman next door again. She was still standing there watching every second like she was waiting for the officers to arrest me. The officer walked over to speak with her while I continued helping the movers unload the truck. I could hear pieces of the conversation drifting across the driveway. "This man is trespassing," she said loudly. "That property belongs to the HOA Lake community." The officer replied calmly, "Ma'am, he showed proof of ownership." She shook her head dramatically. "That's impossible. That house has been part of the association property plan for years." Now here's the important detail Karen didn't know. The previous owner of this property had owned a lot more than just that one house. He owned several houses along the lake road. When he passed away, the properties were sold together in a single estate deal, and I happened to be the person who bought them. But Karen clearly had no idea. She kept pointing toward my driveway while talking to the officer. "He's bringing trucks and equipment into the neighborhood without HOA approval." The officer looked over at the moving truck again and asked her a simple question. "Is this a gated HOA community?" Karen hesitated. "Well, technically no." "Then what exactly is the issue?" She sighed loudly like the officer just wasn't understanding the situation. "The issue is that we have standards here. New residents need approval from the HOA board. Meanwhile, my movers were casually carrying a couch through the front door." The officer came back over to me and asked one more question. "Did you check if this house is part of the HOA?" I smiled. "Yeah, it isn't." He chuckled slightly and nodded. "I figured." At that point, Karen walked across the lawn toward us. She didn't look happy. "You can't just move in here without notifying the association," she said firmly. I explained calmly, "This property isn't part of the HOA." She immediately shook her head. "That's not true. Everything on this road belongs to the Lake Association." Now I knew exactly why she believed that. For years, the HOA had been slowly expanding the neighborhood. They had bought a few nearby properties and added them to their association. But the houses on my side of the street had never been part of that deal, and the previous owner had refused every offer the HOA made. Which meant when I bought the estate, I didn't just buy the house. I bought every property he still owned along the road. Karen pointed toward the dock behind my house. "That dock is shared community access." I looked back at the dock and laughed a little. "No, it isn't." She looked completely offended. "Yes, it is. We've used it for years." That explained a lot. Apparently, people had been using the dock because the previous owner rarely visited the property, but legally, it belonged to the house. The officer cleared his throat and gently stepped into the conversation. "Ma'am, unless you have documentation showing this property belongs to the HOA, he has the right to move in." Karen looked stunned. "You're taking his side," the officer sighed. "I'm not taking sides, I'm looking at the paperwork." Karen crossed her arms and stepped back toward her yard, but she didn't leave. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started making another call. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was more focused on getting my furniture inside and figuring out where everything would go. But about 30 minutes later, another SUV pulled into the street. This one had a small magnetic HOA logo on the door. Two people stepped out and walked toward Karen. She immediately started explaining something while pointing at my house. They looked over at the moving truck, the boxes, and me standing in the driveway holding a lamp. One of them finally walked over and introduced himself as the HOA board president. He asked politely, "Did you just purchase this property?" I nodded. Yes. He asked the question Karen probably should have asked earlier. Did the seller mention whether the property was part of the association? I pulled up the closing documents again and showed him the property map. He studied it carefully. Then his eyebrows slowly went up. He looked back at me and said something that made Karen's entire argument collapse. Karen stepped closer so she could see the map. And that's when she realized something that completely changed the situation. Not only was my house not part of the HOA, neither were the three other houses along the same side of the lake road, and I had purchased all of them. Karen stared at the map silently. Then she looked at me. "You're saying you own all of those?" I nodded. "Yeah, the whole block." The HOA president rubbed the back of his neck and gave an awkward laugh. "Well, that definitely changes things." But Karen still wasn't ready to admit she had made a mistake. Instead, she said something that made the entire situation even more unbelievable. "If that's true, then we need to renegotiate the dock access." And that's exactly when things got interesting. Because the dock Karen's neighbors had been using for years. Technically, it was private property. And the moment Karen decided to push the issue, she accidentally started a conversation that the HOA board had been trying to avoid for years. And by the end of the day, the police call she made that morning turned into the most awkward HOA meeting this neighborhood had probably ever seen. And that's where the real drama began. Because once the HOA board realized who actually owned the entire lakefront section of the road, they suddenly became very interested in talking to me. But Karen? She still thought she could somehow control what happened next. And that was her biggest mistake. The moment the board president asked if we could schedule a meeting later that afternoon, I agreed. I had a feeling this conversation was about to get very interesting. And trust me, what happened at that HOA meeting later that day made Karen regret calling 911 in the first place. The HOA meeting that afternoon started a lot quieter than the morning had. When I walked into the small community clubhouse near the lake, I could already tell word about the situation had spread around the neighborhood. A few residents were sitting in folding chairs along the wall, whispering to each other. Some of them looked curious. Others looked a little nervous. And at the front of the room sat the HOA board president and two other board members, flipping through a stack of papers that looked like property records. Karen was already there too, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, staring at me like I had personally ruined her entire day. I grabbed a chair and sat down across from the board table. The president gave me a polite nod and cleared his throat. "First of all, thank you for coming," he said. "We just want to clear up some confusion about the lakefront properties." I nodded. "No problem." Karen leaned forward immediately. "The confusion is simple," she said. "Those houses have always been part of our community." One of the board members quietly shook his head. "That's actually what we're here to clarify." The president slid a printed map across the table toward Karen. It was the same map I had shown earlier that morning. "This is the official county property record," he explained. "The 4 houses along the east side of the lake road were never added to the HOA. Karen frowned. "That can't be right. Everyone uses the dock behind that house." I smiled slightly. That was more of a neighborly thing. The previous owner didn't mind. Karen looked like she had just heard the worst news possible. "So you're saying the dock is private now?" The president nodded slowly. "Technically, yes." You could hear a few quiet murmurs from the people sitting in the back of the room. For years, many of them had apparently used that dock to launch kayaks or fish in the evenings. But legally, none of them actually had the right to use it. Karen pointed at me like she had just found a new argument. "Well then, he can't block access. The neighborhood depends on that dock." I leaned back in my chair and answered calmly, "I'm not blocking anything, I just moved in today." One of the board members spoke up. "To be fair, we've never had legal access to." "Why?" Karen looked shocked. "What do you mean?" The president sighed and explained something that clearly surprised several people in the room. The previous homeowner declined multiple HOA purchase offers over the years. We asked about buying that section of the shoreline so it could become a community dock. Karen turned toward him slowly. You never told us that. He shrugged a little.
Well,
negotiations never went anywhere. I added one more detail that made the room even quieter. And when the estate went up for sale, all 4 houses were included in the deal. Karen blinked. All 4? Yep. The board president nodded again. He now owns the entire lakefront stretch from the corner road to the old boat ramp. That's when the whispers started getting louder around the room. One neighbor in the back raised his hand. Does that mean the association can't control that section anymore? The board president answered honestly. That's correct. It was never under HOA authority. Karen looked like she was trying very hard to process that information. But we've always treated it like part of the neighborhood, she said. I shrugged. I get that, but the paperwork says otherwise. The president leaned forward slightly and said something that changed the tone of the entire meeting. That's actually why we wanted to speak with you today. Karen raised an eyebrow. About what? He folded his hands on the table. Well, since you now own the entire lakefront block, we were wondering if you might be open to discussing some kind of agreement regarding dock access. Karen immediately nodded like she had been waiting for that. Yes, exactly. The neighborhood needs that dock. I thought about it for a moment. Then I asked a simple question. How many times has the HOA tried to buy that property before? The president looked slightly embarrassed. 3 times over the past decade, and the owner said no every time. Correct. I nodded slowly.
Well, I just moved in today. I think it's a little early to start negotiating land deals.
A few people chuckled quietly in the back of the room. Karen didn't. She leaned forward again and said something that made the whole room uncomfortable. If you don't cooperate, the HOA can make things very difficult for you. The president immediately turned toward her. Karen, that's not how this works. But she kept going. We can enforce neighborhood standards, parking rules, landscaping requirements. I interrupted gently. For properties inside the HOA, she froze, because she suddenly realized something important. None of my properties were part of the association, which meant their rules didn't apply. The board president sighed and rubbed his forehead. Karen, please stop. The room went quiet again. I decided to break the tension. Look, I'm not trying to start a war with the neighborhood. I like the lake. I like the area. I just want to settle in. One of the neighbors raised his hand again. So, are we still allowed to fish off the dock? I laughed a little. As long as people are respectful, I'm not planning to chase anyone away. That answer seemed to relax the room immediately. Karen, however, looked even more frustrated. The president stood up and cleared his throat. Well, I think that answers most of our questions. He looked at me and added politely, and again we apologize for the confusion earlier today. I smiled. No problem. Then he glanced over at Karen. And we especially apologize for the police being called this morning. Several people in the room laughed quietly. Karen stood up quickly and grabbed her purse. This whole situation is ridiculous, she said before storming toward the door. The moment she left, the mood in the room changed completely. One of the neighbors leaned over and whispered to me, "She calls the HOA about everything." Another guy laughed and said, "You should have seen her face when the sheriff pulled up earlier." The board president shook his head. Well, at least now everyone knows where the property lines actually are. The meeting ended a few minutes later, and I walked back down the quiet lake road toward my new house. The moving truck was gone by then. Most of my furniture was already inside, and the sun was starting to set across the water. As I walked past the dock, I noticed 2 neighbors standing there fishing. They waved a little awkwardly. "Hope it's okay we're here," one of them said. I smiled. "Just don't crash any boats into the house." They laughed, and honestly, the whole situation ended a lot more peacefully than it started. Karen hasn't called the police again since that day, and the HOA board now knows exactly where their authority stops, right at the edge of my driveway. Stories like this are exactly why we share them here on Karen Stories Daily, because sometimes all it takes is one phone call and a little paperwork for the truth to completely flip a situation around. Now I'm curious what you think. If someone in your neighborhood called the police while you were moving into your own house, How would you have handled it? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you laugh or reminded you of a crazy HOA experience, go ahead and share the video with a friend. You never know, they might have a Karen living next door too.